We both want to wish the Lionazers the best of luck for tonight. You've done amazingly well in the competition, and we're rooting for you all the way. Good luck. I hope you win. The palace just dropped a bombshell that's left the entire nation reeling. Princess Charlotte, the beloved young royal who's captured hearts worldwide, has mysteriously vanished from the official succession list. What palace insiders are now revealing about this shocking removal will change everything you thought you knew. About the monarchy's future. The shocking discovery. It was a routine morning at Buckingham Palace. Or so everyone thought. The date was November 28, 2025. Then palace officials were preparing for what should have been a standard update to the royal website. The annual review of the succession list, a formality that typically warranted barely a second glance from the public, was about to trigger the most explosive constitutional crisis the monarchy has faced in decades. Sarah Jenkins, a junior digital officer in the palace's communications team, was the first to notice it. As she cross-referenced the updated succession documents with the official database, her hands began to tremble. Princess Charlotte Elizabeth Diana, third in line to the throne, beloved daughter of the Prince and Princess of Wales. It's gone. Not moved down the list, not repositioned, completely removed. Within minutes, Sarah's discovery had reached the desk of Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary. The color drained from his face as he examined the documents. This wasn't a clerical error. This was official. The removal had come from the highest levels of palace administration, signed off by officials whose authority was beyond question. But the why remained a mystery that would send shockwaves through every corner of the establishment. By 9:30 that morning, emergency meetings were already underway. Senior quarters gathered in the Belgian suite, their voices hushed but urgent. The atmosphere was thick with tension. How did this happen? Who authorized it? And most importantly, how long did they have before the media caught wind of what was arguably the most significant royal story of the decade? The palace's initial instinct was damage control. Lock down the information. Issue a brief statement, citing administrative review by Time to understand what was happening before the 24-hour news cycle devoured them whole. But palace insiders knew the truth. In the age of digital transparency and leaked documents, secrets don't keep, especially secrets this enormous. What made the discovery even more perplexing was the timing. Just 3 weeks earlier, Princess Charlotte had accompanied her parents to a state dinner at Windsor Castle. The photographs had been stunning. At 9 years old, she carried herself with a poise that reminded seasoned royal watchers of her late grandmother, Diana. The public adored her. She represented everything fresh and hopeful about the monarchy's future. And now, without warning or explanation, she'd been erased from the line of succession. The king was informed shortly after 10 o'clock. Sources close to Charles describe his reaction as one of complete bewilderment. He'd signed off on no such removal. Neither had Prince William. The order, it seemed, had come from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere within the labyrinth and bureaucracy of palace administration, where centuries-old protocols and modern governance collide in ways even the royals themselves don't fully understand. By midday, Prince William was racing back to London from an engagement in Norfolk. Catherine had been informed by encrypted phone call, her shock palpable. Even through the digital connection, their daughter, their only daughter, had been removed from the succession. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about position or protocol. This was about Charlotte's identity, her future, her very place within the institution. Her family had served for generations. The afternoon brought more questions than answers. Palace lawyers were summoned. Constitutional experts appeared through secure video links. Historical documents were pulled from the royal archives, some dating back centuries. What everyone was searching for was the same thing: legal justification. Because in the British constitutional monarchy, you don't simply remove a royal from the succession without cause, without precedent, without law. As the sun set over London that evening, the palace remained in crisis mode. A media blackout had been implemented. All official communications were suspended pending review. But inside those historic walls, the truth was beginning to emerge. And it was far more complicated, far more disturbing than anyone had initially imagined. The documents that palace lawyers uncovered that first day painted a picture of institutional dysfunction at the highest levels. Somewhere in the process of updating royal protocols to reflect modern sensibilities, someone had activated a clause, an ancient, almost forgotten clause that specifically impacted female members of the royal family in ways that male members were exempt from. The Equal Succession Laws of 2013, which had guaranteed Charlotte's position ahead of her younger brother. Louis hadn't been as comprehensive as everyone believed. The hidden constitutional crisis. The law that emerged from the royal archives was dated 1701. The Act of Settlement, a cornerstone of British constitutional monarchy, was well known to historians and lawyers alike. What wasn't well known were the amendments added in 1763. During the reign of King George III, amendments that had never been formally repealed. Because no one had thought they were still relevant. No one, that is, until now. The language was dense, written in the formal legal style of the 18th century. But the meaning became clear as palace. Lawyers worked through the night of November 28th. Any female heir to the throne between the ages of 7 and 16 could be temporarily removed from the succession if certain conditions were met. Conditions relating to education, religious instruction, and what the document termed moral character assessment. It sounds absurd to modern ears, barbaric even, but there it was in black and white. Signed by King George himself and validated by Parliament of the time. The law had been created during a period of intense anxiety about Catholic succession and foreign influence. Female heirs were seen as particularly vulnerable to manipulation, to marriages that might compromise British interests, to religious conversion that could threaten the Protestant establishment. The 2013 Succession to the Crown Act, which had made such a public show of ending male primogeniture, had focused on birth order. It ensured that an older daughter couldn't be displaced by a younger son. It was hailed as a victory for equality, for modernization, for bringing the monarchy into the 21st century. But it hadn't addressed these older provisions. It hadn't even acknowledged they existed. Constitutional expert Professor Helena Blackwood was brought in to advise the palace, described the situation as a perfect storm of oversight and assumption. Everyone had assumed that gender equality legislation over the decades had swept away all discriminatory royal succession laws. No one had conducted a comprehensive audit of every piece of succession-related legislation going back centuries. Why would they? The monarchy had been functioning smoothly. There was no crisis, no trigger until there was. The trigger, it turned out, had come from an unexpected source. A routine review by the Lord Chancellor's office in late October had flagged inconsistencies in royal succession documentation in the process of modernizing record-keeping systems. Civil servants had discovered these ancient provisions, and they'd done what civil servants do. They'd followed procedure. They'd activated the legally required assessment process for Princess Charlotte. No one had done this maliciously. There was no conspiracy, no plot against a 9-year-old girl. It was bureaucracy at its most coldly efficient. The law said certain things needed to happen when a female heir reached a certain age. Charlotte had turned 9 in May. The wheels of government had turned. The result was her removal from the succession list pending completion of the required assessments. What made this particularly cruel was the nature of the assessments themselves. They were designed for an era when royal education meant something entirely different. When religious instruction was daily and intensive. When moral character was judged by standards that would be unrecognizable today. The criteria were impossibly outdated. Rooted in assumptions about female capacity and virtue that modern society had long since rejected. Palace lawyers found themselves in an impossible position. The law was clear. It had never been repealed. And in the British constitutional monarchy, the rule of law applies even to the law's most absurd manifestations. You can't simply ignore legislation because it's inconvenient or embarrassing. You have to go through proper channels. Amendment, repeal, parliamentary process. But that process takes time, months, possibly years. And in the meantime, Princess Charlotte remained officially removed from the succession. The palace couldn't even acknowledge the situation publicly without triggering a media firestorm that would make the challenges of recent years look like gentle rain. The morning of November 29th brought fresh horrors. Legal experts examining the 1763 amendments discovered additional provisions. Not only could Charlotte be removed from succession during the assessment period, but if she failed to meet the archaic criteria, the removal could become permanent. She could be legally barred from ever becoming queen regardless of her position in the birth order. The criteria themselves were shocking. Proficiency in specific religious texts, demonstration of needlework skills, evidence of submissive and gentle temperament. These were the measures by which 18th century lawmakers believed a future queen should be judged. These were the hurdles that Princess Charlotte, a thoroughly modern child of the 21st century, was now expected to clear. Senior palace officials reading through the documents in disbelief understood immediately that they were staring at an existential threat not just to Charlotte's position, but to the entire premise of monarchy in modern Britain. How could an institution claim relevance, claim to represent the nation's values when it was still governed by laws that treated women as lesser beings, requiring special scrutiny and control? The constitutional crisis ran deeper still. If these provisions applied to Charlotte, they would apply to any future female heir. They would apply to any daughters that Prince George might one day have. The monarchy's modernization efforts, its attempts to present itself as an institution in tune with contemporary values, had been built on sand. Beneath the surface, the old prejudices remained embedded in law. Waiting to resurface by the end of that second day, the full scale of the disaster was clear. The palace wasn't just dealing with an administrative error. They were confronting 3 centuries of institutional sexism that no one had bothered to dismantle, because everyone assumed it had withered away on its own. They were about to learn a hard lesson about the difference between social progress and legal reform. William and Catherine's desperate response. The Prince and Princess of Wales received the full briefing on the morning of November 30th. They sat in the private sitting room at Adelaide Cottage, their usual sanctuary feeling more like a war room as lawyers and advisors presented the impossible situation facing their daughter. Catherine's composure, famous for its steadiness and even the most trying circumstances, finally cracked out her tears weren't just for Charlotte. They were for every woman who'd been told she wasn't quite good enough, every daughter who'd been judged by different standards than her brothers. William's reaction was rage. Pure, barely contained fury at a system he'd spent his entire life serving. He'd been raised to respect tradition, to honor the institution, to put duty before personal feeling. But this wasn't tradition. This was discrimination dressed up in ceremonial robes. This was his daughter being told that her gender made her suspect, made her less, made her vulnerable to removal in ways her brothers would never face. The couple's first instinct was to go public immediately, hold a press conference, lay out the facts, let the court of public opinion tear down these medieval provisions with the force of collective outrage. But the lawyers urged caution, going public without a strategy, without political support in place, risked triggering a constitutional standoff that could damage the monarchy irreparably. So they took a different approach. Within hours, William was on the phone with the Prime Minister. The conversation was frank, stripped of the usual diplomatic niceties. The prince made clear that he expected the government to treat this with the urgency it deserved. This wasn't some arcane legal curiosity. This was his daughter. This was the future of the crown. This required emergency legislation. The Prime Minister, caught between sympathy and political reality, promised to explore options. But he was honest about the challenges. Parliament was gridlocked over other matters. Emergency legislation required cross-party support, and there were MPs, particularly among the more traditional conservative faction, who might see this as an opportunity to grandstand about constitutional orthodoxy and the dangers of rushing to change centuries old. Catherine, meanwhile, took a more personal approach. She reached out to women across the political spectrum: MPs, lawyers, activists, anyone with influence and a platform. Her message was simple. This isn't just about my daughter. It's about what we're willing to accept as a society. It's about whether we truly believe in equality or whether we're content to let it exist only on the surface. While deeper structures of discrimination remain untouched, the response was overwhelming. Within 48 hours, a coalition had formed. Women's rights organizations, legal reform groups, even members of the House of Lords who'd spent decades working on equality. Legislation were horrified to discover these provisions had survived. The palace might have wanted to keep this quiet, but Catherine and William understood that silence was complicity. Behind closed doors, the couple made another decision. They would not allow Charlotte to undergo the archaic assessment process. They would not subject their daughter to examinations rooted in outdated notions of female propriety. If it meant Charlotte remained off the succession list indefinitely, so be it. Some principles were more important than position. This stance put them in direct conflict with palace officials who feared the constitutional implications. If the Prince and Princess of Wales openly defied legal requirements, even unjust ones, it set a dangerous precedent. It suggested the royals could pick and choose which laws to follow. It undermined the very concept of constitutional monarchy. William's response was blunt. The Constitution had already been undermined by allowing discriminatory provisions to remain on the books, by failing to conduct proper legal audits, by assuming that social progress automatically translates to legal reform. The failure wasn't his to own. It belonged to generations of lawmakers and officials who'd been too complacent to do the hard work of actual change. The first weekend of December saw William and Catherine at Sandringham in emergency talks with King Charles. The king was sympathetic but worried. He understood their fury, shared their disgust at the situation. But he also bore responsibility for the institution as a whole. Every action the family took now would reverberate for decades. They needed to be strategic, not just righteous. The conversation stretched late into the night. Charles shared his own frustrations with royal protocol, the constraints he chafed against his entire life. But he also spoke about the delicate balance the monarchy maintained. They existed at the pleasure of the people, governed by laws made by Parliament. If they were seen as putting themselves above the law, even terrible law, public support could evaporate. By Sunday evening, a strategy had emerged. The family would cooperate with legal requirements to the minimum extent necessary, while simultaneously pushing for emergency reform. They would make Charlotte available for assessment, but would publicize every outdated sexist criterion she was expected to meet. They would turn the process itself into an indictment of the system that had created it. It was a risky approach. It meant willingly embracing public controversy at a time when the monarchy could ill afford more negative headlines. But William and Catherine had reached a point of clarity. They would not sacrifice their daughter's dignity to protect an institution that refused to protect her. If the monarchy couldn't survive treating Charlotte with basic equality and respect, then perhaps it didn't deserve to survive at all. The decision was made on December 2nd, just 4 days after the initial discovery. The Wales family would break their silence. They would tell the British people exactly what was happening to Princess Charlotte. And they would dare the establishment to defend the indefensible, the Queen Consort's secret role. What no one expected was Camilla's intervention. The Queen Consort had largely stayed out of succession politics, understanding her own complicated position in the public imagination. But on the evening of December 1st, she requested a private meeting with Catherine. What transpired in that conversation would prove crucial to everything that followed. Camilla arrived at Adelaide Cottage alone, without the usual retinue of staff. She'd asked for discretion, and Catherine had honored that request. The two women sat in the conservatory, tea growing cold as Camilla revealed what she knew. For weeks, she explained, she'd been hearing whispers in palace corridors. References to assessments, mentions of historical protocols. She'd thought little of it until the crisis exploded. But Camilla had done something Catherine hadn't expected. She'd gone digging into her own files, her own records from decades of navigating palace bureaucracy, and she'd found something. Evidence that these same provisions had almost been triggered for other female royals in years past. They'd been quietly fitted. Paperwork filed in ways that technically satisfied legal requirements without subjecting anyone to actual assessment. The revelation was stunning. This wasn't unprecedented. It had happened before, and it had been handled discreetly behind the scenes in ways that protected the individuals involved. The difference was that previous incidents had involved royals with less public profile, or they'd occurred in eras when media scrutiny was less intense. Charlotte's case had become public too quickly for the usual quiet maneuvering to work. Camilla's message to Catherine was clear. There was a path through this that didn't require public confrontation.